Okay, so for 44 years, the entire world basically held its breath. We're about to dive into a global rivalry between two superpowers that completely defined the 20th century. But here's the craziest part. They never actually fired a single shot directly at each other. This is the story of the Cold War. And the name itself is pretty fascinating. It actually came from the writer George Orwell, way back in 1945. That's before the whole thing even officially kicked off. He had this incredible, almost eerie foresight, picturing a world living under the constant shadow of nuclear weapons, locked in this permanent Cold War, a conflict with no actual, hot and heavy battle. So what was it officially? Well, the Cold War was this super intense geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, and of course, all their allies. It ran from 1947 all the way up to 1991. And what made it so unique, so different, was that it wasn't fought on some traditional battlefields. No, at its very core, this was a clash of two totally opposite ideologies, American-led capitalism versus Soviet-led communism, and it was all played out through spies, a terrifying arms race, and these brutal proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam. So how did this all even start? I mean, how did the world go from being allies in World War II, fighting together against a common enemy, to a planet just completely split in two? Let's take a look. This quote right here, from Winston Churchill in 1946, just perfectly captures the new reality. He stood up and declared that an iron curtain had fallen across Europe. Now, this wasn't a physical wall, not yet anyway, but it was this stark political and ideological barrier splitting Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe from the US-aligned West. And on each side of that curtain, you had two completely different worlds. Over in the West, you've got the United States leading the charge for capitalism and democracy, forming the NATO alliance. And in the East, you have the Soviet Union, totally driven by communism and holding their allies together with the Warsaw Pact. I mean, even their plans to rebuild Europe, the Marshall Plan versus the Molotov Plan, were in direct competition. Faced with this expanding Soviet influence, the US came up with a really key strategy: containment. The whole idea, which was laid out in the Truman Doctrine back in '47, wasn't to try and get rid of communism where it already existed, but to just contain it, to stop it from spreading to any new countries. This single policy would basically guide everything America did for decades. But containment definitely didn't mean peace, not by a long shot. Let's dig into how this divided world just rapidly escalated into this massive technological and military arms race, a race that took the conflict from the battlefields of Korea all the way to the cosmos. And this escalation was just incredibly fast. Seriously, think about it. In just a few short years, you get the Truman Doctrine, then the Berlin Blockade, then the Soviets test their own atomic bomb, which ended the US monopoly just like that, and then the Korean War breaks out. By 1957, with the launch of Sputnik, the rivalry is literally blasted into outer space. It was just one major crisis right after another. So, with both sides now armed with nuclear weapons, this terrifying new doctrine emerged: massive retaliation. The logic behind it was chilling, but it was also pretty simple. The US basically said that it would respond to any Soviet aggression with a completely devastating nuclear attack. This created what they called a balance of terror, where the threat of mutually assured destruction was, paradoxically, the very thing that kept the peace between the superpowers. But that balance, that terrifying balance, almost broke. So now we're going to slow things down a bit and focus on what was probably the single most dangerous moment of the entire 44-year conflict, those 13 days in October of 1962. So this is the crucial question, isn't it? How close did the world actually come to all-out nuclear war? The answer is terrifyingly close. So here's how it went down. It all started when American spy planes discovered the Soviets were secretly building nuclear missile sites in Cuba. That's just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. President Kennedy's response? A naval quarantine, basically a blockade, to stop any more missiles from getting to the island. For 13 days, the world just watched, completely on edge, until a deal was finally hammered out. The Soviets agreed to pull the missiles out, and in return, the US promised not to invade Cuba, and in a secret part of the deal, they agreed to remove their own missiles from Turkey. After staring right into that nuclear abyss, both sides kind of realized they needed to take a step back. And this led to a new period known as détente, a thaw in those icy Cold War tensions. Now, détente was a really complex era. It ran from the late 1960s to 1979, and it was pretty much defined by a general easing of tensions. Look, it wasn't an end to the rivalry. I mean, the Vietnam War was still raging, but it was a very conscious effort to manage the conflict and, open up some lines of communication. And this period actually saw some incredible diplomatic breakthroughs. In '72, President Nixon made a historic visit to China, which was a brilliant move that helped split the communist world. In that same year, the SALT I Treaty was signed. That was the first real agreement to limit nuclear arsenals. And then came the Helsinki Accords, which were all about improving relations and human rights across the Iron Curtain. But that thaw didn't last. The moment that just completely shattered this era of cooperation was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. That one act reignited the Cold War, and it plunged the world right back into a period of deep, deep mistrust and hostility. But this second, colder phase of the Cold War, well, it would be its last. So let's jump to the final act, where decades of tension just unraveled with this breathtaking speed. The beginning of the end really came from inside the Soviet Union itself. Their new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, introduced these two really radical policies. First was perestroika, which means restructuring, and it was his attempt to fix the collapsing Soviet economy. The second was glasnost, or openness, which allowed for way more freedom of speech than ever before. He really hoped these reforms would save the system, but what they ended up doing was exposing all of its fatal weaknesses. So with glasnost encouraging people to speak out, and the Soviet Union basically saying it wouldn't use force anymore to prop up its puppet states, a firestorm of change just swept across Eastern Europe in 1989, one after another. Peaceful revolutions toppled the communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, you name it. And then came the moment that symbolized it all. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall, the most potent, most powerful symbol of the Iron Curtain, it fell. Crowds from east and west just flooded the streets, celebrating together, literally dismantling the barrier that had divided a city and a continent for almost 30 years. The final domino fell just 2 years later. Weakened by all the internal revolts and total economic failure, the Soviet Union itself officially dissolved on December 26, 1991. After 44 long years, the Cold War was over. And that kind of brings us to a final thought. I mean, the Cold War is officially history. But when you look at the world today, at the alliances that still exist, the conflicts that are still going on, and the thousands of nuclear weapons still out there, you really have to ask yourself, does its shadow still shape our world? It's definitely something to think about.